You need to hold on to those fancy words that tell all about the topic as you read. Watch me show you what I mean about holding on to those fancy words. I'm going to read this nonfiction book called Honeybees by Alan Walker, and I'm going to list all the fancy words that I learned in this book with my fingers at the end of the book. Avid readers hold on to what they learn. Bees. There are thousands of different kinds of flying insects. One kind is the bee. So is a butterfly. So is a ladybug. I don't see any fancy words here, so I'm going to keep reading. There are about 20,000 kinds of bees. The 4 kinds we may see the most are honeybees, the bumblebee, carpenter bees, and sweat bees. I don't see any fancy words here, so I'm going to keep reading. I just see words that I've heard before. Honeybees. One very important kind of bee is the honeybee. Honeybees are social. A very, very fancy word. It is in bold black letters. Social insects and live in colonies. Social means to live together. Colonies means a group. These colonies build homes called hives. Inside the hive, the bees build a comb made of beeswax. Comb. That's another fancy word. I've never really heard of that word before. Must be important. That must be the home of the bee. 3 kinds of bees live in a hive. A queen bee. Her job is to lay eggs. A drone bee. Drone bees are male. Their job is to mate. A black bold word, fancy word, with the queen. Mate means to get together. Worker bees are female. Most of the bees in the colony are worker bees. Worker bees build the hive and comb and collect pollen and nectar. Other fancy words that I'm sure we'll learn about. Honeybees' body parts. They have 3 main body parts. The head, which we've heard before, the thorax, kind of a fancy word, the abdomen, and they also have legs, 6 to be precise. And of course, they have wings, all words we've heard before. Honeybees at work. Honeybees help pollinate plants. Pollinate, fancy word. They fly from plant to plant and collect pollen. They carry the pollen on their legs in pollen socks. Wow, that's interesting. I've never seen that before. Honeybees also collect nectar, another fancy word. I've heard of that word. Butterflies drink nectar. That must be the juice from the flowers. They use their proboscis, another fancy word, to suck nectar from their flower. Looks like it's their long nose. Bees store the nectar and pollen in the cone. The nectar turns into honey. The bees use the honey and the pollen for food. Do you remember hearing or reading any fancy words on this page? No, but nectar and pollen are other words that we've learned before that are fancy. I hope you remember what they mean. Ooh, only female bees have a stinger. We all know what a stinger is. The stinger is used if the bee or colony, a fancy word we learned before, feels threatened. The sting of a honeybee is painful. It will cause a sore spot and swelling. That could be a fancy word. Once a honeybee uses its stinger, it dies. Phew. Honeybees play a very important role in nature. If you see a honeybee, don't be afraid. Don't bother it, and it won't bother you. At the end of a nonfiction book, sometimes you'll see a glossary. A glossary is filled with fancy words. They are black bold words that explain their meaning. Do you remember the fancy words in this book that we learned? Colonies, mate, nectar, pollinate, proboscis, social.